There are a couple videos on this channel that are inevitable, and this is one of them. The John Cassavetes video. He's my favorite filmmaker. I absolutely adore his films and his philosophy, and I find a lot of myself in him. And I guess where I'll start on my John Cassavetes story is my own work. In 2016, I shot my first feature film. At the time, I was in film school, and there was a lot of pressure to write scripts and cast and do all this very traditional beat-by-beat step of how to make a movie. And going into my first feature film, I felt a lot of that pressure. And ultimately, I decided to shoot it no different than I did all my home videos growing up, just goofing around with friends on camera. And that's a film called Are Sasquatch. It's up on the channel. And it was made in my hometown for like $200 for props and nothing else on VHS camcorders. Very raw. And I had such a blast making it, and it was exciting to see that my very loose improv, make it up as you go format works in a feature film package. And it was the following year in film school that I had a film history class that introduced me to John Cassavetes, and I dove into his stuff. And his first film, Shadows, is this very scrappy film from the 50s that he rented out an acting space and just put up flyers, and I think he maybe put an ad in the paper for like anyone who wants to make a movie, come and do this, and they cast off the street. And he's known as the Godfather of independent filmmaking, or independent American filmmaking at the very least, because he was doing it before anyone else even thought to do it. Shadows was scraped together for, at the time, what was, I think, $40,000, which is quite a bit adjusted for inflation, or maybe that is adjusted, I don't know. But ultimately, he made this movie by the sweat and blood of his own hands. Blood sounds bad. I think it was a positive thing, but and it's a very scrappy movie. It's very rough around the edges. You watch it, and you're seeing the making behind the movie too. You're like, this is scrappy. And there's a fun behind the scenes story that he told in a documentary I watched, where he said that they recorded Shadows, and one of the sets, one of the apartments they filmed in for a lot of the scenes was right below a ballet studio. So all the audio was like so bad because they had this like ballet dancing above the apartment. And he said they spent years maybe like trying to clean up the audio. They were trying to fix it, and they just couldn't. They slaved for hours trying to figure out how to make the audio cleaner. And ultimately they just said, okay, we have to release it like this. And it played, they submitted it, and it played at a festival. And apparently everyone like applauded how natural and raw everything was. They loved the audio. They loved how raw it was, which is such a funny thing to hear, because he thought like, oh God, people are gonna hate this. It's amateur. It seems bad. It seems cheap. And people like applauded that aspect of the film, this raw, like non-polished, contrary to what you were seeing coming out of like 1950s Hollywood, which was polished and big and expensive. And then people love that about it. And I think that's such a beautiful lesson to filmmakers everywhere. That's like, don't slave away making your film polished and perfect, because if anything, there's going to be a lot more truth in that raw, unpolished, imperfect film. And the more time you waste doing that, the more time you could have been spending making the next thing, or like showing people the last thing, or just getting your stuff out there. I think more than ever, imperfection should be embraced online, because we know we're watching people make stuff. We're not watching studios make stuff online. We're not watching big companies make stuff with thousands of people. We go into online content not with the expectation to see a Marvel movie level of polish, and that's kind of the joy of it. That's one of the benefits of online content. It's not one of the detractors. And But I saw that film, and it's pretty good. It didn't grab me. I love that he made it that way, and I appreciate it for how important it is in like film history for that reason. But I think he made a couple studio films, then he made this film Faces that I watched next, and it just blew me away. It's just like a devastating movie about like marriage and like love and like betrayal and trust, and all it is like about 6 really long conversations that are like roller coasters. You see these characters go through so much in the process of like 20-minute conversations, and it's just devastating because it's just these people who are unable to be honest to each other and unable to be open to each other and vulnerable to each other. And it's just like a thesis on how many things we hide behind. We hide behind our stories and our dancing, and we hide behind our jokes, and when we have so much we actually can and should say. And to see a movie that raw and honest about like people, Americans at the time, and how imperfect and broken our homes were coming out of the 60s was just so exciting. And here it still had that rawness. You know, it was a much more controlled rawness than something like Shadows. You know, it felt intentioned. It felt like he knew what he was doing to a purpose at this point, but he didn't let that like dictate and like keep him down. He still allowed things to be loose. The camera work is all these like close-ups and zooms, and it'll drift out of focus, and it'll like move from one person to the other. It feels very improvised in the technical aspect as well. And that's an element I haven't mentioned yet. He heavily used improv to build his films. And my understanding of his process is he would improvise with these acting troupes, his acting friends, and they would just like improvise stories and characters, and from that improv build a shooting script and then use that to shoot the movie. And his films are so raw, I guarantee that sometimes there was a lot of improv on set as well. One thing I really admire about him is he said he thinks he's a horrible director because he just lets everyone do what they want. He says everyone that comes onto his films is an active participant, an active creator in what they're making. And that's an energy I hope to capture in my work. And I think my work that I'm least proud of is the ones that I feel like I had my fingers too much on every aspect. Like I like people came on merely to execute my vision rather than to collaborate and create something with me. Those are the ones that I feel less excited about than the ones that feel totally free. And this is all to say that watching this movie Faces, I was just like, oh my God, like I'm onto something. And not to toot my own horn, but I was like, here's somebody in film history who has stood the test of time, you know, still remembered and beloved 50, 60, 70 years later, his films. And they're just like him and his friends getting together, improvising, being raw, not caring about the technical elements, you know, making stuff on the cheap, retaining ownership of his work. And he's just such a renegade in that way, because he did a few studio films and he like notoriously hated the experience. He like decried it and said it was horrible. But ultimately, a lot of his films he just made under his own dime. You know, he went broke making them. He cashed out credit cards, and you know he maxed out credit cards and everything like that, which isn't good advice. But I think nowadays you can make movies for $0 and they're strictly time investment. So it's not so much like you have to max out credit cards paying for the film and developing. Nowadays you could just max out your time, whatever free time you have, or earn yourself free time, find a way to get more free time and create with it. And I think what John Cassavetes was doing at the time is so inspiring because it was so much harder than it is now. You know, doing what he did back then now is easy. You know, you could get your friends together today and shoot a scene that is exactly like a John Cassavetes scene on your iPhone, and it would freaking play well. And you know, you could get all your friends together a couple weekends in a row, and bam, you have a John Cassavetes style movie. And I know you don't need to rip him off, you don't need to copy his style, but it's a great building point because all his films are, for the most part, very small and focused in scope. They're their conversations, their arguments, their people not connecting. And another great film is A Woman Under the Influence, with his wife Jenna Rowlands was in a lot of his films. And they're such a dynamic duo, and Peter Falk is in this. And it's just every film you watch, you're like, this is as good as acting gets. You know, you watch this movie and Jenna Rowlands' performance in this is just one of the best ever. It just breaks my heart. It's just about a woman who is just so troubled, and her family and her husband want to help, but they have none of the tools to help. They don't know what they're doing, and it's just this cyclical thing where these people kind of tear each other apart in their attempts to love each other and in their attempts to help each other. And his stuff is just like so confrontational, because for me, I'm not watching it thinking what a great story. I'm watching it and seeing myself in these characters. I'm like, how have I been selfish? How have I been blinded by my love? How have I hurt people in my attempts to make them feel better? How have people done that to me? And I think there's such universal qualities to the specificity of his stories, because they're these really specific, sad stories that, you know, somehow I still come away feeling like I looked in a mirror. And then a couple other movies. Opening Night, really fucking great movie with Jenna Rowlands once again. She's a theater actress and just going through hell during this production. And his movies have so much empathy for all the characters on screen. You really like get a feel for why each person is doing what they're doing, and his characters usually act pretty erratically. They'll do something you don't understand, and even then in that you'll be like, holy shit, like I get that. Like I've done stuff that in retrospect I'm like, why did I do that? I've seen people do stuff and I'm like, this isn't like the person I love. Why did they do this? And it's so hard to be confronted by that. And I just think he understands humans so well. It's just so beautiful how he is able to capture the inconsistencies in the people we love, the things that like you think you know someone until you don't, and then you still know them despite that. You know, a couple other movies of his, Minnie and Moskowitz, that one blew me away. It's like a lesser known one of his, or a lesser talked about one of his, and even then, like, there's scenes in it that elicit more out of me than like whole movies. Just like really powerful little character moments or monologues. He makes all these small choices like that, like I was talking about with Ozu. He makes these small choices that like, you're just like, God, that's so beautiful. So simple to do that rather than the big thing. And what's it? Gloria, he did a studio movie with Jenna Rowlands where it's like kind of a mob movie. That one didn't work that well for me, because it took his raw character-based stuff and tried to cram it into like a studio genre film. And they butt heads a little for me. I didn't love it, but it has some funny moments and some fun moments. A Killing of a Chinese Bookie, a really interesting sort of like unglamorous mob movie. It's an unglamorous, not even mob, but like a guy has to do a hit on a guy to pay off his debts. And it's just, it's just the least appealing version of that possible. You know, I think like someone like Scorsese still paints mobs and stuff like that in a very unglamorous fashion, but this just takes it to another level. It's just so raw and so unfulfilling, and there's no like big like punishment. There's no like big like, well, this guy ruined his life. It's more just this quiet, unsatisfying like, what have I done? And I really appreciated that about the movie. And lastly, his film Love Streams is currently, I'd consider it my favorite film of all time. I encourage people to watch it after watching some of his other films. I think it very much plays as one of his last films, or his last film rather. It's very much a goodbye to love and him wrestling with love, a goodbye to Jenna, his wife, because they play opposite of each other in the movie. He's such a good actor too. He's a phenomenal actor. But it's just a devastating movie where it's like every freaking thing this guy did in his career was some attempt to understand love, some attempt to get to the bottom of it. And this last movie is just like a Hail Mary, like what the fuck is love? And it almost comes around to such an abstract, obscured answer that you're like, he never figured it out, and that's the answer. You know, the answer is you won't get a clear answer, and he says goodbye with that, and it's really tragic and beautiful. And the first 2 times I watched it, literally cried for 30 minutes. Like I've never had a movie do that to me before. I just sat alone watching the credits, and I cried until the credits were done. Kept crying. And it's just like, it has such a raw power over me. And I do think it should be watched later in his films, because it's more interesting having an understanding of his style and his obsession with love and him and Jenna's relationship. And also watch behind the scenes stuff. There's a couple great documentaries about John Cassavetes. I think one was called The Man and His Work. Another one I watched, I forget the title, but there's just a ton of great behind the scenes stuff, and seeing him talk about making stuff, and seeing him say like fuck the system, seeing him say like we make it so they want us to work for them, and then we say fuck you, you know, he says stuff like that. And just watch this clip on YouTube, John Cassavetes' Television Sucks. It's him and him and his cast at a screening of opening night. And he just goes off, you know, he's just saying like people are sheep, and he knows what they're making is amazing, and just people aren't curious, and people just follow what's popular. And you know, what he says in that interview fucking 50 years ago is just as applicable now to like freaking studio films and Marvel movies. And you're just so you see the anger, you see that he's sick of the bullshit, he's sick of the violence, he wants like honest human stories to prevail, and that's something he fought for until he died. He died in the 80s of I think it was cirrhosis. He was a big alcoholic, but he's such a fascinating person that I relate so much to in so many ways. From his bare bones, go get him independent filmmaking, to his obsessions with love and working with his friends, and being so stuck in his ideas in a way that's admirable and not like foolish. You know, it's admirable that he's like, I'm not giving up on this dream, this idea that we could do stuff ourselves, and it's powerful and it's important. And I think it's just so, his philosophy was so far ahead of its time, and it's more applicable than ever. It's more you could put it into practice easier than ever. It's just really inspiring to watch somebody doing that when it was so much different, and yet, you know, the ideas ring true. And I could talk about him forever. I somehow haven't seen all of his movies. There's quite a few I haven't seen. Too Late Blues, some of his studio ones I haven't seen. And I think he's less proud of those ones because of studio meddling, but I still want to see them. But yeah, I just adore John Cassavetes. Good starting film, I think, is Faces. I think Faces like shows you his style. It's very raw, it's confrontational, but it's like a controlled version of that raw thing. I think Shadows is a bit like too raw and rough around the edges to like hold your attention or grab you in the same way that like Faces would. And if you like Faces, you'll like the rest of his stuff. If you don't like Faces, still try his other stuff, because I think his style does evolve and change while still staying true to some of the core roots. Yeah, that's all I really have to say. I freaking love John Cassavetes. I love movies. Thank you so much for watching. I love you guys. Bye-bye.